I have never felt more ashamed of an Australian government's actions. Even though we predicted it here on Thursday night with former Labor MP Michael Danby, it seemed impossible to comprehend. The way the Albanese Labor government on Friday night, our time in New York, abandoned Israel, rewarded bloodthirsty terrorists, shamed our nation and further exposed us to the risks of Islamist extremism is really a new low, and it demonstrates in its own right why this government just has to go. Yes, it's guilty of many other sins, the usual sins of the left, runaway spending and the expansion of government in the usual ways of the democratic socialists, the intensification of our energy crisis, hurting working families in an effort to appease the climate goals of the United Nations, and displaying the left's endemic weakness, of course, on border protection and national security. Sure, I call this stuff out day after day. But this lily-livered stance in the United Nations that had us voting against Israel and against the US, but with Russia, with China, with North Korea, with Iran, as well as with the whole swathe of so-called non-aligned and Muslim nations. This takes Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong's behaviour to a whole new low. This shames us as a nation, and it shames all of those, living or dead, who have had faith in this country, standing up for freedom, for democracy, for the rule of law, and for decency. Even the UK, where, as we saw last week, Islamist candidates are starting to take power in local government elections, the UK had the courage at least to abstain in this vote. Like the Netherlands, like Sweden, even Canada, the painfully woke nation of Canada, had the sense to abstain. But we voted yes with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with Pakistan, with Iran, Russia and China. Oh, and yes, with France. Are we supposed to console ourselves by noting we lined up with France, a weak nation whose population has so often paid a high price for that weakness? Let's be very clear here. Let's join the dots. What's changed? What has led Australia to Australia abandoning Israel and suggesting that Palestine can be treated as a country even before it negotiates borders, even before it has a functioning leadership, even before it provides security guarantees to Israel, even before it establishes the rule of law and a viable path to a two-state solution? What has changed is October the 7th. This vote at the United Nations and this sickening backflip by Australia, by Albanese and Wong in the name of Australia, is a direct reward to the evil Islamist extremist terrorists of Hamas for the atrocity they committed on October the 7th. The greatest single massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust has delivered a political reward for Hamas. Australia's statement at the UN pretended this was a repudiation of Hamas because Hamas will never accept two states. It's pledged to the annihilation of Israel. But Hamas has run Gaza for almost 2 decades. Israel completely withdrew in 2005, pulled out its own settlers, left Gaza to the Palestinians, and Hamas was elected to run the joint. The same terrorist group that now extends the war in Gaza, hiding among the civilian population, the people it uses as involuntary human shields. Who else can lead Gaza? And who leads the West Bank? The Palestinian Authority? Fatah? What's their plan? Where's their security guarantee for Israel? Yet Penny Wong says recognition can somehow come before peace.
This vote is not about whether Australia recognises Palestine. We will do that when we think the time is right. What we would say, and what I do say, is Australia no longer believes that recognition can only come at the end of a peace process. It could occur as part of a peace process.
Penny Wong, Australia's argument is practically nonsensical. A two-state solution surely is further away today than it has been for decades, precisely because of October the 7th. The argument put by Wong is also morally repugnant because it rewards terrorism. It advances the Palestinian cause on the back of the Hamas atrocities. And it's dangerous for global and national security for the same reason. Because when you reward terrorism, you invite more of the same. Let me remind you again of what Australia and the UN has rewarded. Let me remind you about some of the detail of what was done on October the 7th when Hamas murdered 1,200 people, men, women and children, kidnapped 250 and raped and wounded hundreds more. Now, this is disturbing viewing. Again, it comes from the documentary I told you about last week, Screams Before Silence.
העצים האלה, כל עץ ועץ פה ראיתי בחורות קשורות, עם הידיים גופות. מישהו רצח אותם, אנס אותם, תעלל בהם, פה בעצים האלה. מי שרואה זה יודע שהתעללו בבנות. מישהו הפשיד אותם, מישהו אנס אותם. מעל 30 בנות נרצחו ונאנסו פה. לראות דברים כאלה.
It's okay.
Yeah, the horror among those trees. We had to edit that down. The film relays more detail that's just too horrific for television at this time of day. Have a look at the full documentary on YouTube if you can. And yes, those trees turned into instruments of torture, rape and murder, they're gum trees. Australian eucalypts that you see planted all over Israel. But Australia now has abandoned Israel as a result of that atrocity committed against Israel. We've rewarded Hamas and punished Israel. Ponder that for a moment. Ponder what that says about Australian values and Australia's place in history. This sickens me. This is why this government simply has to go. They've tarnished us all and they've offered an enticement to terrorists. And when you ponder why they did it, the nausea really kicks in. They didn't do it for strategic necessity. They didn't do it for reasons of foreign policy consistency. They didn't even do it as a misguided way to encourage peace in the Middle East. They did it for base political reasons, to lock in the votes of large Muslim communities in crucial seats in southwestern Sydney and in Melbourne, and to help fend off the Greens in seats like Anthony Albanese's himself and Tanya Plibersek's in inner Sydney. They've traded Australia's support for Israel and our stance against terrorism for votes in crucial Labor seats. Selling out our national interest, selling out Israel and providing comfort to the Islamist terrorist groups for the sake of narrowly targeted votes in domestic politics. It's that transactional, it's that morally repugnant, and it's that dangerous for our nation. And imagine what it does to the Jewish Australian community. Imagine how it heightens their fear, their vulnerability in the here and now. Let me remind you about some of the people Australia has abandoned. Let me remind you about the Bibas family. Here is mother Shiri in terror as she and her baby boys Kafir and Ariel are taken as hostages by Hamas on October the 7th. The boys' father was killed, as were their grandparents. But that mother and her two sons were taken back to Gaza. They were confirmed alive by other hostages 3 months later, but are now unaccounted for more than 7 months on. This mother and her two beautiful boys either dead or still held as hostages. And while they and others endure that torture, while we wait to learn their fate, Australia has helped to give Hamas a public relations win, a political win at the United Nations. It's unthinkable. I put this badge on air, as many of you would have seen, on the 6-month anniversary of October the 7th, saying I'd leave it on till all the hostages were freed. But our government can't wait to move on. It puts no pressure on Hamas. Instead, it puts pressure on Israel and holds out ridiculous hope of a two-state solution while Hamas still holds hostages and prolongs an horrific war. The only sign of hope in Labor is that one serving MP, Melbourne Jewish member for Macnamara Josh Burns, has broken ranks and publicly declared his own government should have abstained in this vote. And former soldier and Defence Materiel Minister Mike Kelly, who heads up Labor Friends of Israel, agrees.
We feel it would have been better to abstain on this vote, as 25 other countries did, and to be in the company of the UK, Canada and the US.
Yeah, a couple of voices of sanity and decency, but they're given short shrift by what's now a shameless government. We can't afford to have a national government that's prepared to play so fast and loose with matters of substance and matters of national security and morality. We can't afford to have a national government that's prepared to roll over on the very values this nation is supposed to promote and uphold. They're unfit to govern. They're unworthy of this great nation.